They called her an Apache girl, and that was all it took for the town to decide who she was. The rope hung still in the dry morning air, swaying just enough to catch the light, while dust drifted across the main street like something trying to cover what was about to happen, and Lena Whitlock stood on a wooden crate that creaked under her weight, her hands steady at her sides, her eyes moving slowly from one face to another as if she were memorizing them, not with fear, but with something quieter, something that made a few men shift their boots against the dirt without knowing why. No one shouted now, not anymore, because the moment had grown too heavy for noise, and even the wind seemed to hesitate as it passed between the buildings, carrying the faint smell of leather, horse sweat, and old wood warmed by the sun. Sheriff Dalton Reeves stood a few feet away, one hand hovering near the lever he wasn't ready to pull, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to meet hers for more than a second at a time, because there was something in that girl's gaze that didn't match the story they had all agreed upon the night before. They said she was Apache, said it like it explained everything, said it like it gave them permission. A woman near the front clutched her shawl tighter, whispering something under her breath about stolen cattle and missing supplies. Though no one could point to anything Lena had taken, no one could say when they had seen her do wrong, only that she didn't belong, and out here, that was often enough. The crate shifted slightly beneath Lena's boots, the wood letting out a soft groan, and still she didn't speak, didn't plead, didn't offer the kind of defense people expected from someone standing where she stood, because she understood something they didn't, that once a story takes hold in a place like this, truth has to wait its turn. A small boy near the edge of the crowd tugged at his father's sleeve, his voice just loud enough to carry in the silence, asking a question no one wanted to answer, and the father hushed him quickly, eyes darting toward the sheriff as if the wrong words might tip the balance of something already leaning too far. The sun climbed a little higher, casting sharper shadows, outlining the rope, the crate, the girl, turning them into shapes that would linger in memory long after the moment passed. And still no one stepped forward, no one said stop, because each man waited for another to be the first to doubt what they had all decided together. Lena's gaze finally settled on the far end of the street, beyond the gathered crowd, beyond the tension that hung thicker than the dust, and for a brief second, something shifted in her expression, not hope, not fear, but recognition, as if she had been expecting something all along, something the rest of them couldn't yet see. And in that quiet, stretched moment, the town held its breath, not because they were certain of what they were doing, but because deep down, where no one dared to speak, they were beginning to wonder if they had already made a mistake they couldn't take back. The sheriff cleared his throat, but the sound did not carry far, swallowed by the stillness that had settled over the street like heat before a storm, and his fingers hovered closer to the lever without ever quite touching it, as if the distance of a single inch could decide whether he was a man who followed the town or a man who stood apart from it. And Lena Whitlock watched him with the same quiet attention she had given everyone else, not pleading, not accusing, simply waiting the way someone waits for a clock to finish counting down a moment already set in motion long before they arrived. A loose board somewhere along the saloon wall tapped softly in the breeze, steady and uneven, and it became the only sound anyone could focus on, because it was easier than listening to their own thoughts, easier than asking the question that had begun to rise in more than one chest, a question that had no clear answer and no safe place to land. The small boy from earlier shifted his weight again, his boots leaving faint prints in the dust, and this time he did not whisper, he spoke just loud enough that those nearest could hear him clearly, asking why no one had asked the girl her name. And the words fell into the space between people like a stone into still water, sending out ripples that no one could pretend not to feel. His father tightened his grip on the boy's shoulder, not harshly, but firmly enough to guide him back a step, and though the man said nothing, his eyes flickered toward Lena for a fraction longer than before, as if trying to find something there that matched the story he had accepted without question the night before. Lena's gaze did not waver, but something in it shifted, softer now, almost like recognition of the boy's voice, and for a moment it seemed as though she might speak, as though she might offer them something to hold on to. But the moment passed, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Sheriff Reeves finally drew in a breath deep enough to move his shoulders, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. saying that the town had rules, that strangers could not simply walk in and expect trust, that there had been reports and concerns and enough reason to act, even if those reasons felt thinner now than they had hours ago. And as he spoke, he avoided looking at the girl, choosing instead to fix his gaze somewhere above the crowd, somewhere distant where the words might feel less personal. A man near the hitching post shifted his hat back on his head and muttered that no one had actually seen her take anything, and another answered quickly that it did not matter, that sometimes you could tell by the way a person carried themselves, by the look in their eyes, by the fact that she had no place to point to and say she belonged. And the exchange did not grow louder, but it spread. Quiet voices passing uncertainty from one person to the next, like a current running just beneath the surface. Lena slowly lifted one hand, not in defense, not to stop anything, but to reach toward the small chain that rested against her collarbone, drawing it forward just enough that the metal caught the sunlight. And for the first time, a few people leaned in without realizing they were doing it, their attention pulled not by force, but by something subtler, something that suggested there was more to see if they were willing to look. The pendant was simple, silver worn smooth with time, its edges softened as if it had passed through more than one set of hands, and there was a marking on it, faint but deliberate, a design that did not belong clearly to one world or another, and Lena held it there for a second longer than necessary before letting it fall back against her chest, as if she had offered them a piece of something they did not yet understand. The sheriff noticed it then, really noticed it, and his brow furrowed in a way that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with memory, though whatever he was reaching for remained just out of grasp, like a name you almost remember but cannot quite say. The wind picked up slightly, carrying dust across the street again, brushing against boots and skirts and the hem of Lena's dress, and still no one moved to finish what had been started, because the certainty that had brought them here was no longer as solid as it had seemed, and in its place was something far more dangerous, something that did not shout or demand, but lingered quietly, asking each person the same question in a different way. What if you are wrong? The pendant settled back against Lena's chest with a soft, almost inaudible sound, but the effect it left behind lingered far longer than the movement itself, because now the crowd had something real to focus on, something that did not fit neatly into the story they had been telling themselves, and Sheriff Reeves felt it most of all, that quiet shift from certainty to doubt, the kind that does not arrive loudly but settles in the bones, making every decision feel heavier than it should. He stepped forward half a pace, boots pressing into the dry dirt, and for the first time since this had begun, he looked directly at her, not as a problem to be handled, but as a person he might have misjudged, and his voice, when it came, had lost some of its earlier firmness, asking her where she had gotten the pendant, not accusing, not demanding, just asking, as if the answer might matter more than everything else that had been said so far. Lena did not answer right away, and the pause stretched long enough to make several people shift where they stood, because silence, in a place like this, often carried more weight than words, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, quiet, and clear enough to reach the edges of the gathered crowd without effort, saying that it had been given to her, not taken, and that it had been earned, not found. And those words landed differently than anything else that morning, because they did not defend her, they did not plead for understanding, they simply stated something that could not be easily dismissed. A man near the saloon frowned, rubbing his jaw as if trying to place a memory that refused to come into focus, and another woman leaned closer to her neighbor, whispering that the design looked familiar, though she could not say from where, and little by little, the certainty that had bound them together began to loosen, replaced by a quiet unease that moved through the group like a change in the wind. The boy who had spoken earlier took another small step forward before his father could stop him, his eyes fixed on the pendant, and he said that he had seen something like it before, not in town, but out near the old trading road where travelers sometimes passed through, and his voice carried a kind of honest curiosity that no one could mistake for defiance. And this time, his father did not pull him back right away, as if even he was beginning to listen. Sheriff Reeves narrowed his eyes slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought, and he reached up to adjust his hat, a habit he fell into when something did not sit right, and for a brief moment, he looked older than he had before, like a man carrying the weight of choices he had not yet made, but already felt responsible for. Lena's gaze moved to him again, not challenging, not fearful, simply present. And in that look there was something else now, something that suggested she knew more than she had said, something that made the space between them feel like it held an answer just out of reach. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves against hard ground, faint at first, almost easy to miss if not for the way it echoed between the buildings, and a few heads turned toward the far end of the street without anyone saying a word, because out here, certain sounds carried meaning long before they became clear. The rhythm grew steadier, measured, unhurried, and it did not carry the urgency of trouble, but the weight of arrival, the kind that suggested whoever was coming was not concerned with being late or early, only with being there when it mattered. Lena heard it too, and this time, she did not look at the crowd or the sheriff. She looked toward that distant point where the road met the horizon, and something in her expression settled, as if a piece of the moment had finally fallen into place. The people closest to her noticed the change, subtle as it was, and it passed through them in a way they could not explain, a quiet understanding that whatever they thought they knew was about to be tested by something they had not planned for. Sheriff Reeves followed her gaze, his jaw tightening again, but not with the same certainty as before, more with anticipation now, and his hand, which had hovered near the lever for what felt like an hour, dropped slowly to his side, because for the first time since this had begun, he was no longer sure that finishing it was the right thing to do. The sound of the approaching horse grew clearer, each step deliberate, each movement carrying across the open space like a statement, and as the figure began to take shape at the edge of the town, framed by dust and sunlight, no one spoke, because they all felt it, that shift from judgment to waiting, from action to pause, and in that fragile, suspended moment, the town stood on the edge of something it did not yet understand, something that would not raise its voice, would not demand attention, but would change everything simply by being seen. The rider did not hurry, and that was the first thing everyone noticed, not the horse, not the dust trailing behind, but the pace, steady and unbothered, like a man who had already decided what mattered and saw no reason to rush toward it. And as he came closer, the shape of him grew clearer against the pale light of the morning, a broad-shouldered figure sitting easy in the saddle, hat pulled low, coat worn but well kept. The kind of man the frontier did not break easily because he had already learned how to bend without giving in. The sound of hooves slowed as he reached the edge of the gathered crowd, and no one moved to stop him, though several men shifted slightly, instinctively making space without realizing they were doing it, because something in his presence asked for room without ever demanding it. He drew the reins gently, and the horse settled with a quiet snort, dust curling around its legs, and for a moment, the man simply sat there, taking in the scene, the crate, the rope, the girl, the sheriff, each detail passing through his gaze without reaction, but not without understanding. Then he swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion, boots meeting the ground with a soft thud, and the silence that followed felt different now, no longer uncertain, but waiting, as if the town itself had stepped back to see what he would do. Sheriff Reeves straightened slightly, pulling at the front of his vest as though remembering his role, and he spoke first, his voice steadier than before, but still carrying the weight of everything that had already shifted, asking the man his business, asking it like a formality rather than a challenge, and the rider answered simply, saying his name was Ethan Cole, that he had come through this town before, though it had been some years, and that he had heard enough from the road to know something was happening here that might require a second look. A few heads turned at the name, not because it was famous, but because it carried a faint recognition, the kind that sits just beneath memory, and one older man near the back narrowed his eyes as if trying to place it, though he said nothing. Ethan did not look at the crowd again after that, his attention settling on Lena, and there was no surprise in his expression when he saw her, no confusion, only a quiet focus that made it seem as though he had been expecting to find her here, or someone like her, standing exactly where she stood. He took a few steps forward, slow and deliberate, stopping a few feet from the crate, close enough to see her clearly, far enough to give her space, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, but something passed between them all the same, something the rest of the town could not hear, but could feel, like a change in pressure before a storm breaks. Ethan's eyes dropped, to the chain at her neck, to the pendant that had already unsettled the crowd, and when he saw it, truly saw it, something in his posture shifted, not dramatic, not sudden, but unmistakable, like a man who has just found a piece of a puzzle he had long stopped trying to solve. He reached up slowly, not toward her, but to his own chest, drawing out a thin cord from beneath his shirt, and at the end of it hung a piece of silver worn in the same way, shaped in a similar pattern, though not identical, and the two objects seemed to echo each other in a way that no one present could ignore, even if they did not yet understand what it meant. A murmur moved through the crowd, quiet but undeniable, and Sheriff Reeves took a step closer, his eyes moving between the two pendants, his earlier doubt sharpening into something more focused, more urgent. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach those nearest without effort, saying that pieces like these were not traded, not stolen, not passed around without reason, that they were made with purpose and given with intention, and that seeing one meant something, but seeing two meant something else entirely. He lifted his gaze back to Lena, and there was no accusation in it, no challenge, only a question that did not need to be spoken aloud, and Lena met it without hesitation, her expression unchanged, but her eyes holding something deeper now, something that suggested the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of dust and leather across the street, and no one moved, no one spoke, because the story they had built was beginning to come apart at the edges, and in its place, something far more complicated was taking shape, something that would not be settled by a label or a guess, something that demanded more than assumption. Sheriff Reeves looked down at his own hands for a brief second, then back up at the girl, then at the man who had just arrived, and for the first time since this had begun, he stepped back, not forward, his body giving ground in a way that said he understood, even if he could not yet explain it, that whatever came next would not belong to him alone. And in that quiet space, with the rope still hanging untouched and the crate still creaking beneath her boots, the town found itself no longer certain of anything except one simple truth, that the girl they thought they understood was no longer standing there alone. The two pieces of silver caught the light at the same time, and for a brief second it felt as though the entire street leaned toward them without moving, drawn by something no one could quite name, and Ethan Cole let the pendant in his hand rest against his palm, not hiding it, not displaying it, simply allowing it to be seen, while his eyes remained fixed on Lena, steady and searching, as if he were reading something written long before this moment. He took another step closer, slow enough that it did not feel like an approach, more like a continuation of something already in motion, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight now, not questioning the town, not addressing the sheriff, but speaking into the space between himself and the girl, saying that he had seen only one other piece like that in his life, years ago, carried by someone who had no reason to trust him and every reason not to, and yet had chosen to anyway. The crowd listened without meaning to, pulled in by the quiet certainty in his tone, and even those who had been most certain earlier now found themselves holding back, because whatever this was, it no longer fit the simple shape they had given it. Lena's fingers brushed lightly against the pendant at her chest, not gripping it, not presenting it, just acknowledging its presence, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but no less steady, saying that some things were not meant to be explained to a crowd, and that some truths did not belong to people who had already made up their minds. The words did not carry defiance, only a calm refusal to be reduced to something smaller than she was, and they settled over the town in a way that made more than one person look down at the ground rather than meet her gaze. Sheriff Reeves shifted again, his weight moving from one foot to the other, and he glanced toward Ethan as if searching for something to hold on to, something that could guide him out of the uncertainty he now stood in, and Ethan did not look away from Lena when he answered, saying quietly that the town had already taken something that could not be easily returned, and that if they were going to continue, they ought to be certain of what they were doing, because doubt, once it settled in, had a way of staying. A man near the edge of the crowd muttered that this was getting too complicated, that they had acted for a reason, that they could not simply undo it because of a piece of metal and a few words, and another answered, not as loudly as before, that maybe they had not had as much reason as they thought, and the exchange did not grow into an argument, but it did not fade either, it lingered, stretching across the group like a line drawn in the dirt that no one was quite ready to cross. Lena looked at Ethan then, really looked at him, and for the first time, something like recognition flickered in her eyes. Not surprise, not relief, but the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had been carrying a story alone and was beginning to see that it might not remain that way. And she spoke his name without asking, without hesitation, as if she had known it long before he had spoken it. And the sound of it in her voice shifted something again, subtle but undeniable. Ethan's expression did not change much, but there was a tightening at the corners of his eyes, a small sign of something deeper beneath the surface, and he inclined his head slightly, not in greeting, not in agreement, but in recognition of his own, as if confirming what had already passed between them without words. The sheriff noticed that too, and his gaze moved quickly between them, the pieces beginning to form a picture he did not yet fully understand but could no longer ignore, and he cleared his throat again, though this time it sounded less like authority and more like hesitation, asking Ethan what exactly he was suggesting, what this meant for what they had already set in motion. Ethan finally turned his attention to the sheriff, and there was no challenge in his face, no accusation, only a quiet firmness that carried more weight than raised voices ever could, and he said that what it meant was simple, that the town had mistaken certainty for truth, and that once you did that, you owed it to yourself to stop long enough to find out the difference. The wind moved through the street again, lifting dust into the air, softening the edges of everything for a moment, and when it settled, the rope still hung untouched, the crate still held Lena steady, but the crowd was no longer the same as it had been minutes ago, because now they were not standing together in agreement. They were standing together in doubt, and that was something far harder to resolve. No one stepped forward, no one called out, and in that growing silence, the town began to understand, slowly and without anyone saying it aloud, that whatever came next would not be decided by what they had assumed, but by what they were finally willing to see. The silence stretched until it no longer felt like something that might break, but something that had settled in for good. And Sheriff Reeves let out a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding, his hand lifting halfway toward the lever before stopping again, not because someone had told him to, but because something inside him had finally caught up with what his eyes had been seeing, and he lowered it, not dramatically, not in surrender, but in quiet recognition that the moment had shifted beyond his control. Ethan Cole did not move, did not press, did not force the issue, and that was what made the difference, because out here, men expected confrontation, expected raised voices and hard stances, but what they were given instead was stillness, and in that stillness, each person was left alone with their own thoughts, their own reasons, their own doubts, and those were far harder to ignore. A woman near the front adjusted her shawl again, but this time her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the uneasy awareness that she had been certain only minutes ago and now could not say why. And she looked at Lena not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as someone she did not understand, and that felt different, heavier somehow. The man by the hitching post removed his hat slowly, running a hand through his hair as if trying to clear something from his mind, and he said, almost to himself, that if the girl had wanted to cause trouble, she would not have stood there the way she had, would not have stayed silent when speaking might have saved her sooner, and no one answered him. Because there was no easy reply to that, only the quiet acknowledgement that he might be right. Lena remained where she was, steady on the crate, the rope above her unmoving now, as if it too had lost its purpose, and her eyes moved once more across the crowd, not searching for sympathy, not asking for anything, simply seeing them as they were, and that, more than anything, made several people look away, because it is easier to judge someone from a distance than it is to stand in front of them and be seen clearly. Ethan finally spoke again, but softer now, his voice not carrying far, meant more for the sheriff than the crowd, and he said that there are moments when a town decides what kind of place it is going to be, not through laws or words, but through what it chooses to do when no one is forcing its hand, and that this felt like one of those moments, and Sheriff Reeves nodded slightly, almost without realizing it, because he knew the truth of that even if he had not wanted to face it before. The boy who had asked the questions earlier stepped forward again, this time without being pulled back, and he looked up at the sheriff, then at Lena, and he said that she did not look like someone who was lying, and his voice carried no weight of authority, only honesty. But sometimes that was enough to tip something that had been leaning for too long, and a few heads turned toward him, not in annoyance, but in quiet agreement. The wind moved again, lifting the dust just enough to blur the edges of the street, and when it settled, the town looked the same as it had before, the same buildings, the same people, the same worn boards and sun-faded signs, but something inside it had changed, something that could not be seen, but could be felt in the way no one stepped forward to continue what they had started. Sheriff Reeves took a step toward the crate, then another, his boots pressing into the dirt. With more certainty than before, and when he reached Lena, he did not look up at the rope, did not touch the lever, he looked at her, meeting her eyes fully for the first time, and there was no accusation left in his expression, only the weight of a man realizing he had almost made a choice he could not have taken back. He reached out, not to pull, not to command, but simply to offer a hand, and for a brief second, the entire town seemed to hold its breath again, not from tension this time, but from something quieter, something closer to understanding. Lena looked at his hand, then at his face, and after a moment that felt longer than it was, she stepped down from the crate on her own, not needing help, not refusing it either, just choosing her own movement, her own moment, and when her boots touched the ground, the sound was soft, almost lost in the dust, but it carried farther than anything that had been said all morning. No one cheered, no one spoke, because there was nothing to celebrate, only something to accept, and as Lena stood there, no longer elevated, no longer set apart, the town found itself facing not the girl they had named, but the truth they had nearly missed, and in that quiet realization, something heavier than judgment settled over them, something that would not leave quickly, something that would stay long after the dust had settled and the street had emptied, reminding each of them that sometimes the hardest thing to face is not what you did, but how close you came to doing it. No one moved to rebuild what had just been undone, and that was the strangest part of it all, because out here, people were used to filling silence with something, a word, a laugh, a command, anything to keep the weight from settling too deep, but now the silence stayed, and it pressed in from all sides, not loud, not demanding, just present, and in that presence, each person found themselves standing a little differently than before. Lena adjusted the pendant at her chest without thinking, her fingers brushing the worn silver as if grounding herself in something older than this town, older than this moment, and when she looked up again, her eyes were not searching anymore. They were steady, settled, as though whatever she had been waiting for had already come and gone, leaving behind something quieter in its place. Ethan remained where he stood, not stepping closer, not stepping away, giving the space room to breathe, because he understood something the others were only beginning to feel, that what had just happened did not need to be explained to be understood, it only needed to be allowed to settle. Sheriff Reeves let his hand fall fully to his side, and for the first time that morning, his shoulders eased slightly, not from relief, but from the acceptance of something he could not change, and he removed his hat slowly, holding it in both hands as he looked out over the crowd, not as a lawman now, but as a man who had been part of something that had nearly gone too far. A few people began to shift, small movements at first, boots turning, shoulders angling away, as if the moment had quietly released them from whatever had held them in place, and yet no one rushed to leave, because leaving too quickly would have meant pretending nothing had happened, and no one seemed ready to do that just yet. The boy stepped forward again, this time stopping a few feet from Lena, looking up at her with the kind of open curiosity that only comes when fear has been replaced by something else, and he asked her what her name was, not because he needed to know, but because it felt like something that should have been asked from the beginning, and Lena looked down at him, her expression softening just enough to be noticed, and she answered simply, her voice quiet but clear, giving him her name without hesitation, as if it had never been in question, and the sound of it settled over the crowd in a way that no accusation ever had. Ethan glanced at the sheriff, then back at Lena, and there was a moment there, brief but unmistakable, where something passed between them again, something unspoken but understood, and he gave a slight nod, not of approval, not of command, but of acknowledgement, as if confirming that the path ahead did not require him to lead it. A man near the back cleared his throat, then spoke, not loudly, but enough to be heard, saying that maybe they had been too quick. That maybe they had let fear fill in the spaces where facts should have been, and no one argued with him, not because they all agreed fully, but because none of them could say he was wrong. The woman with the shawl lowered it slightly from her shoulders, her grip loosening, and she looked at Lena again, this time without the tightness that had marked her earlier expression, and though she did not speak, there was something in her face that suggested she was seeing more than she had before. Sheriff Reeves stepped back once more, giving the space back to the street, to the people, to whatever would come next, and he placed his hat back on his head, not as a symbol of authority, but as something familiar, something that reminded him of who he had been before this morning had begun. The rope still hung above, forgotten now, its purpose dissolved into the air along with the certainty that had brought it there, and no one reached for it. No one mentioned it, because some things, once they lose their meaning, are better left untouched. Lena took a step forward, then another, moving through the space that had once been held against her, and the crowd parted without being told, not out of fear, but out of something closer to respect, though no one would have used that word aloud. As she passed Ethan, she paused for the briefest moment, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough for him to see that she understood, and then she continued on, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, leaving behind a street that felt both the same and entirely different. No one stopped her, no one called out, and as she reached the far end of the town, the dust rising lightly around her boots, the people who remained found themselves standing in a silence that no longer felt uncertain, but reflective, as if each of them had been given something to carry, something that would not weigh them down all at once, but would stay with them in small, quiet ways, long after the moment itself had faded. The town did not return to its old rhythm right away, and that was the part no one spoke about, because it is easy to believe that once a moment passes, everything settles back into place, but out here, moments like that did not disappear. They lingered in the spaces between words, in the way people paused a little longer before speaking, in the way they looked at one another, as if seeing something new where something familiar used to be. The rope still hung from the beam, untouched, but now it seemed smaller somehow, less certain of its purpose, swaying gently as the breeze moved through the street, and a man eventually stepped forward, not with urgency, but with quiet intent, reaching up to untie it, not making a show of it, not drawing attention, just removing something that no longer belonged, and as the rope came free, it felt like the town let out a breath it did not know it had been holding. Sheriff Reeves watched it happen without intervening, his eyes following the motion, and there was no resistance in him now, only a kind of acceptance that settled deep, the understanding that authority was not always about acting, but sometimes about knowing when to stop. Ethan remained near the center of the street, his posture unchanged, but his gaze had shifted slightly, following Lena's path as she moved farther away, her figure growing smaller against the open stretch of road, and there was no urgency in him to follow, no need to call her back, because whatever had needed to be said between them had already passed in the quiet moments no one else had fully understood. A few townsfolk began to disperse, not all at once, but in ones and twos, each person carrying something different from the morning, some with relief, others with unease, and a few with something heavier that did not yet have a name, but would stay with them long after the dust had settled. The woman with the shawl lingered a little longer than most, watching the direction Lena had gone, and for a brief second, she looked as though she might say something, might call out, but the words never came, and she simply turned away, her steps slower than before, her shoulders less rigid, as if something inside her had softened in a way she was not yet ready to admit. The boy stood where he had been, his eyes still fixed on the road, and he asked his father why no one had asked sooner, why it had taken so long for someone to see what had been there all along, and the man did not answer right away, because there was no simple answer, no easy explanation that could make sense of what had almost happened, and after a moment, he simply placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, not to silence him this time, but to steady himself, because sometimes children ask the questions adults spent their lives avoiding. Sheriff Reeves finally turned, looking out over what remained of the gathered crowd, and he spoke, not loudly, not with command, but with the quiet weight of someone who understood that words mattered more after they had almost failed, and he said that the town would remember this, not as a story to tell, but as something to carry, something to measure themselves against the next time certainty came too quickly and no one responded. Not because they disagreed, but because they knew it was true. Ethan glanced at the sheriff, giving a small nod that was not approval, not judgment, just acknowledgement. And then he turned toward his horse, his movements unhurried, as if the moment had already passed for him, as if he understood that his part in it had never been to lead, only to stand where he was needed and no further. He mounted without difficulty, settling into the saddle with the same ease he had arrived with, and for a second, he looked once more down the road where Lena had gone, the sunlight catching the edge of his hat, casting a shadow across his eyes that made it impossible to read exactly what he was thinking. And then he turned his horse slightly, not in pursuit, but in quiet agreement with the direction she had taken. The town remained behind him, quieter now, changed in ways that would not be spoken aloud. And as he began to ride, the sound of hooves against the dry ground echoed softly through the street, not breaking the silence, but becoming part of it, a reminder that not all endings needed to be marked by words. And as the dust settled once more, drifting slowly back to the earth, the place where it had all unfolded stood still under the wide sky, holding onto the weight of what had nearly been, and the quiet truth of what had been revealed, knowing that out here, the hardest lessons were not the ones shouted across a crowd, but the ones that arrived in silence and stayed long after everyone had gone. By late afternoon, the town had fallen into a rhythm again, but it was not the same rhythm it had known that morning, and anyone who had been there could feel the difference in the way doors closed a little softer, in the way voices stayed a little lower, as if something unseen had settled over the place and asked to be respected. The sun hung lower now, casting long shadows across the street where the crate had been kicked aside and the beam above stood empty, the rope gone without ceremony, leaving behind only a faint mark where it had once been tied, and that mark remained, small and easy to miss, but impossible to forget for those who knew what it meant. Sheriff Reeves stood outside his office for a long while, hat in hand again, though this time there was no crowd, no pressure, just the quiet company of his own thoughts, and he watched the road where Lena had disappeared, not expecting to see her return, not hoping for it either, just acknowledging the path she had taken and the part he had almost played in stopping it. Inside the saloon, men spoke in lower tones, not out of fear, but out of something closer to reflection, and every so often, one of them would glance toward the door as if expecting something to walk back in, something that would explain what they had all felt but could not quite put into words. The boy sat on the edge of the boardwalk, his boots swinging above the dirt, tracing lines with the toe of one shoe as he replayed the morning in his mind. And when his father joined him, he did not ask the same question again, because he had already seen the answer in the way the adults had changed, in the way they had stopped before it was too late, and that was enough for him, though it would stay with him in ways he would not understand until years later. Out on the road, far beyond the edge of town, Lena walked without looking back, her steps steady, her pace unhurried, the pendant resting against her chest as it always had, catching the light now and then as the sun dipped lower, and there was no anger in her, no need to return what had nearly been done, because she carried something else instead, something quieter, something stronger, the understanding that she did not need the town to know her truth in order for it to remain true. Ethan rode at a distance, not close enough to be seen, not far enough to be gone, his presence a quiet line drawn across the horizon, and though he did not call out to her, did not try to close the space between them, there was a kind of agreement in the way they moved along the same road, each on their own path, each carrying a piece of the same story without needing to speak it aloud. The land stretched wide around them, open and indifferent, the kind of place where a person could be lost or found depending on what they carried inside, and as the light softened into evening, the world seemed to settle into a calm that had nothing to do with what had happened and everything to do with what had been learned. Back in town, the mark on the beam would fade in time, worn away by weather and years, but the memory would not, because out here, people did not always talk about the things that shaped them most, they carried them instead, in the way they paused before judging, in the way they listened a little longer, in the way they chose, when it mattered, to wait. And if anyone ever asked what had happened that day, the answer would never come as a loud story or a proud telling. It would come in quieter ways, in the hesitation before a harsh word, in the choice to look twice before deciding, in the understanding that sometimes the truth does not arrive with noise or proof or force, it arrives in silence, and it stays there, waiting until someone is willing to see it.